Tonight,
every right we enjoy as Americans under the First Amendment has been attacked.
Is the government targeting free rights? A look at why some House Republicans say yes. Plus,
an unemployment rate is at 3.4%, a 50-year low.
President Biden touting economic progress, but prices still soaring.
We have a significant road ahead to get inflation down.
The latest on the American economy. And
the conditions living in here were better for them than being enslaved.
How the dismal swamp became a refuge for 50,000 runaway slaves. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The so-called weaponization of the government takes center stage on Capitol Hill. Thanks for joining us in Washington. I'm Jenna Browder. Shedding light on the claim American citizens are being targeted by various government agencies. That's the goal of the newly formed Weaponization of Government Subcommittee. The Republican-led committee held its first House hearing today, promising to highlight violations of American civil liberties. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka joins us with tonight's top story. Matt?
Well, Jenna, it was a promise made by House Republicans during the midterms to amp up investigations and oversight into the Biden administration. Today's first hearing is the first step in that process, focusing on what House Republicans call a politically charged FBI and DOJ. Witnesses included other senators and congressmen, as well as some former FBI agents. Republicans are trying to make the case that the government is trampling on Americans' rights. But for Democrats, the committee amounts to political theater.
Americans have concerns about the double standard at the Department of Justice. Americans have concerns about the Disinformation Governance Board that the Department of Homeland Security tried to form. Americans have concerns about the ATF and what they're doing to the Second Amendment. And of course, they have concerns about the IRS and the thousands of new agents who are coming to that organization. And finally, there are concerns about what we've learned in the Twitter files.
It's one thing to engage in systematic oversight driven by a commitment to facts and the truth, and something radically different to set up a platform for a series of hit-and-run partisan attacks that are just vindictive, vendetta-driven.
According to one of today's witnesses, constitutional law professor Jonathan Turley, legislation to stop the problems should certainly be an option.
For the government to be in the business of silencing citizens, it's wrong. We saw it during the McCarthy period, where the government was behind the blacklisting of individuals. We said it was wrong. It was wrong then. It's wrong now. We have to have that debate, and it has to move somewhere beyond our normal partisan divisions.
Now, what we do know about what comes next for the subcommittee is that they will be speaking with Mark Houck in about 2 weeks. Houck's home was raided by the FBI last fall in a move that drew sharp criticism from some members of Congress who said Houck was targeted for his pro-life beliefs. He was recently acquitted of the federal charges relating to an altercation with a Planned Parenthood volunteer. We caught up with Houck at the State of the Union on Tuesday night, where he was invited as a guest of Pennsylvania Congressman Scott Perry.
We got to share our story. They need to know the facts of how not only my children were treated, how reckless it was an act of terror. They need to hear all that. They need to hear how I was treated like a complete animal and chained and shackled to a table for 6 hours. And it's a viewpoint discrimination. That's what we have to prove.
Houck's interview is supposed to take place February 22nd. It could end up being formal testimony before the committee. The committee's chairman, Jim Jordan, told me previously that could also be a possibility. So a lot of ground still to cover, Jenna.
All right, Matt Galka, thank you very much. Well, today Congress was finally briefed on the Chinese spy balloon. Both the House and Senate receiving full classified briefings. And the House passing a measure to condemn China for it. Lawmakers voting unanimously 419-0 to hold China responsible for the spy balloon that crossed the United States before it was shot down off the coast of South Carolina. Many lawmakers in both chambers asking why it was allowed to cross the U.S. at all.
I, along with many of my colleagues on this committee, have been ringing the alarm bell on Chinese aggression long before last week's news. And I will take on anyone to make sure China does not weaken our country. That's why I'm prepared to hold anyone accountable, including the folks seated before this committee today, to get real answers This administration owes Americans answers not only on what happened this past week, but on what steps they're going to take to ensure that this never happens again.
And the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Hemispheric Affairs testified why the balloon crossed the country after President Biden was briefed.
The military recommended taking the balloon down over water. Waiting to do so had 3 benefits. First, it gave us additional time to observe the balloon, again, assessing the PRC's capabilities and tradecraft. Simultaneously, we protected against intelligence collection. Second, this allowed us to refine options and decrease the risk of debris causing harm to civilians. And third, waiting to shoot the balloon down over water improved our prospects at recovery, which are ongoing.
All right, for more on this, we're joined by Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Michael, welcome. Always good to see you. So what do you make of that explanation we just heard? Did the military need to wait until the balloon was over the ocean before it shot it down? Of course, you know, floated over some pretty sparsely populated places on land.
Hi, Jenna. Well, on this one, I do agree with the Biden administration. I'm certainly a critic of the Biden administration when I think they're wrong, for example, on the pullout from Afghanistan. But on this, I don't really think that there was that much concern about what this satellite or this balloon could learn that satellites can't, especially when we could protect against it. And so I could be missing something. I don't know exactly what capabilities were on the balloon and what kinds of communications the Chinese might have thought they were going to be able to pick up. And maybe they even relayed some information back before the balloon was shot down. But my best assessment is that this balloon never had that much capacity that satellites don't provide already. And especially when you know where it's going, you know it's there. I agree with the explanation that we should wait until the damage and the risk are minimal. But, you know, people will disagree on that. I'm actually more interested in the question of just how long do we put the U.S.-China relationship in the freezer over this issue? Because I see this in the pecking order as, you know, sort of a new thing, a shocking thing, but not radically different from things that countries have done before, including the United States. We used to overfly countries without permission with aircraft like the SR-71. And so I see this as a bad thing China did, but not horrible in the same way that, you know, Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine is horrible. It's a different level of offense, and I think we have to calibrate our punishment of China accordingly.
Michael, what if China was to do this again? What kind of conflict do you think that could invite?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, you know, because any claim they might have made that they were sort of exploiting this gray area, the high stratosphere or whatever, obviously that was nonsense to begin with, and it would be doubly nonsensical or triply if they were to try it again. So, yeah, I think it's at some point you do up the ante. Bear in mind that we sail a lot of ships and fly airplanes just off the Chinese coast. We do it legally, but we do it in a way that the Chinese find, you know, asymmetric. They can't do that to us. So part of this is a sign of their weakness, that they know they can't collect against us the same way we collect against them. But your question's well taken. And I think this is the sort of thing where you first look at the technologies involved and you ask which areas of technology can we further punish with economic restrictions. That would be certainly one part of the answer. You could also imagine doing some modest infringements of their own territorial airspace with our aircraft. I don't like that because it's dangerous, but, you know, like you say, if it were to happen again, you probably need some tougher responses above and beyond what you would do the first time.
Speaking of technology, New York Times is out with a piece that explains why the Chinese used the balloon. Essentially, these balloons are able to hover for longer and can pick up transmissions that satellites can't. Michael, in this case, the old technology is besting the new technology.
Yeah, in a way, that's right. You know, I mean, the balloon is about 1/10 the altitude of a low Earth orbit satellite, or 1/20th, because the balloon is up there at about 12, 14 miles, and satellites are around 150 to 500 miles if they're in low Earth orbit. So you're 10 times closer. And that means with the same sensor, you can see, you know, an order of magnitude more clearly with greater resolution. And you may be able to pick up faint communication signals that wouldn't make their way 10 times further out to orbit. So in that sense, it really is a sort of a clever technology. I don't want to tip my cap to the Chinese, but it does sort of fill in this interesting zone. That said, we are pretty capable of seeing what we want to see from low Earth orbit with satellites, and I don't think the Chinese learned that much from this balloon.
All right, Michael O'Hanlon with the Brookings Institution. It's always good to see you. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Overseas tonight, more than 20,000 people are reported dead in Turkey and Syria after Monday's devastating earthquake, including at least 3 Americans. Hope is fading for more people to be found alive. But teams from around the world are strategically working to help victims.
But we're logically going through the area, street by street, gathering as much information as possible, and so we can send that back to our command and control and then organise the teams to come back with specific tools and actually prioritise each of the areas and hopefully have some good news and get those people back and repatriate, obviously, the loved ones to their families.
As the clock ticks, rescuers are working tirelessly to find survivors. It's likely to be weeks before a final count can be determined. From inflation to recession, when we come back, all things economy. Stay tuned. Welcome back. New jobless claims show a slight jump. That's according to data out today from the Labor Department. It found 196,000 people applied for new unemployment benefits last week. That's up 13,000 from the previous week. Overall, though, unemployment sits at 3.4%, the lowest rate since 1969. And something President Biden touted in his State of the Union address.
I ran for president to fundamentally change things, to make sure our economy works for everyone, so we can all feel that pride in what we do. To build an economy from the bottom up and the middle out, not from the top down. So let's look at the results. We're not finished yet by any stretch of the imagination, but unemployment rate is at 3.4%, a 50-year low.
And here with us now is Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst for Bankrate. Mark, good to see you tonight. So when you see a small uptick in new unemployment claims, does that concern you at all?
Good to be with you, Jenna. We always are going to be watching these numbers for a sign of worsening in the job market. The reality is that aside from this weekly increase, the number of people who are filing new claims for unemployment benefits remains at a very low level. And so despite the fact that we've had a huge pickup in the number of job cut announcements since the year began, most of those occurring within the technology sector, we've not seen that filter on through to people who are requesting jobless assistance. Could that happen in the weeks and months ahead? Absolutely. It remains something to watch.
Yeah. A topic of discussion for many lawmakers is the debt ceiling. What happens if no agreement is made by the June deadline?
Well, first of all, Jenna, I think the actual deadline, the so-called X date, during which the government would run out of money and face the inability to pay its bills, is actually kind of a moving target because let's say in the coming months, we're obviously talking here in early February, the amount of money that the government takes in is in question. That depends on the performance of the economy, tax receipts. Part of that is the performance of business and even individuals' own incomes. But to your point, this would be an unprecedented default by the U.S. government, something that has never happened before by our government. And it's widely agreed that that could produce a potentially economically catastrophic result. It would also be essentially self-inflicted. And I think that's why even the Speaker of the House and the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, are suggesting that we should not cross that line.
Yeah, it seems like lawmakers are always pulling, able to avoid it with a continuing resolution or one way or the other. The president is pushing a message of a strong economy, but a recent Washington Post ABC News poll found 58% disapprove of how he's handling it. Where is the disconnect there?
Well, first of all, there's a strong divide there, as with so many things, as you know, Jenna, between what Republicans feel, what Democrats feel, and what independents feel. Stop me if you've heard this story before. And so, yes, taken together, there's widespread disappointment about the performance of the economy. And what is the major complaint, of course? That has been inflation, and that's been unprecedentedly horrific, historically high inflation, the worst in 40 years. The good news is that in the past 2 months, we've actually seen prices coming down. not rising, but coming down. We still have to pay the price for the price increases that we've seen over the course of the past year. We have some big updates on inflation coming up next week. Those will be closely watched. It's understandable that people are disappointed, upset about inflation, because essentially that's a tax on everybody's personal household situation.
All right, Mark Hamrick with Bankrate.com. Great to have you on this evening, as always. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
A safe haven for runaway slaves will take you to the unlikely spot where thousands found refuge during the quest for freedom. When Faith Nation returns. February is Black History Month, and a new Pew Research Center poll is taking a look at what Black Americans say is most needed to overcome racial inequality. At the top of the list, voting. 63% of Black adults see voting as the biggest way to help Black people move towards equality. 58% see supporting African American-owned businesses as an effective strategy for Black progress. Notably, only around 4 in 10 say the same about protesting. Snakes, insects, flies, and thick cover. The Great Dismal Swamp, as it's called, is a thriving refuge for wildlife. But generations ago, it served as another type of sanctuary. It was a place of refuge for people desperate to escape the bondage of slavery. Charlene Aaron brings us that story.
The Great Dismal Swamp once covered nearly 1 million acres between northeastern North Carolina and southeastern Virginia. Between 1620 and around the time of the Civil War, it served as a thriving refuge for runaway slaves who chose to build their lives here in freedom, no matter the conditions.
You have venomous snakes biting insects and flies, thick cover of greenbriers. A great place as a refuge for wildlife, not as much probably a great place refuge for people.
As many as 50,000 runaway slaves, called maroons, an indigenous term, settled here on small rises of land known as Mesic Islands. Chris Lowy manages the swamp's National Wildlife Refuge in Suffolk, Virginia.
The amazing part about the escaped slaves living here in the swamp is that the conditions living in here were better for them than being enslaved. And that is, that is a difficult concept to understand today.
They established hidden communities in these heavily treed wetlands, building cabins and possibly farming small plots of land. Researchers believe the former slaves fed their families by hunting deer, wild turkey, and other game, skills they may have learned from Native Americans who also sought shelter here. The runaways went to great lengths to keep their settlements secret due to fear of being captured by slave owners. Dr. Dan Sayers, an archaeologist at American University, has studied the Maroon Islands for more than 10 years.
What I'm finding out there in the middle of the swamp is these big old cabin footprints and a fire pit and all this stuff that shows, that this is a really active landscape. And most, not to say all, most of the material culture or artifacts is stone. And it's in equally abundant is burnt sand and clay.
Sayers realized he was on to a significant discovery.
It'd be little pieces of clear glass. It'd be a couple white clay tobacco pipe fragments, some iron or metals fragments or little pieces. A smattering of nails, some lead shot, a couple gun flint chips. There's enough stuff artifacts. I was able to definitely feel and definitely know that this was of historic period.
As a direct descendant of a slave who helped to build the Great Dismal Swamp, Eric Shepard shares a personal connection to this history.
The story of the enslaved people that escaped the plantations and went and lived in the swamp was really, first introduced to me in the slave narrative of my ancestor Moses Grandy, where he was employed as a boatsman or waterman.
Grandy traveled the swamp's canal and learned to navigate boats as logging operations and trade expanded at the site. He and other slaves dug the canal and several ditches by hand.
As the swamp is today, yes, slave labor, those people have a permanent mark on the swamp as it is today.
After arranging to buy his freedom, Grandy dictated his story, sharing about life as a slave and working in the swamp, never mentioning his interactions with escaped slaves living deep in the swamp.
He had to still be mindful of when he shared his story, that it was you had to protect the people. It was a certain amount of secrecy.
While many made the swamp their home, others saw it as just a stop on their journey north as part of the Underground Railroad.
Dismal Swamp was a refuge. It was a haven for the Underground Railroad activity. But can you imagine down in Louisiana, if you get to the Dismal Swamp, you're almost home free.
In 2004, the refuge was designated an important landmark on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Freedom Maroons in the swamp preferred to living in captivity.
On the one hand, it tells us just how horrible slavery was, right? And really, let's not forget the racism and the white supremacy part of that.
When slavery ended in 1863, residents were free to leave the shadows of the swamp, moving to surrounding communities, a time Shepard compares to the biblical account of Israel's deliverance from bondage.
How did God deliver them out? Who can't explain it? There's only one explanation. The same God yesterday, today, and forever.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Glimmers of hope amidst the devastation. This miraculous moment in the aftermath of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. When we come back. Finally tonight, the aftermath of the 7.8 magnitude earthquake in Turkey and Syria has been devastating. But amid the sorrow, incredible stories of survival. One such glimmer of hope, an Israeli military team in Turkey digging for hours in a race against the clock after reports of a crying toddler from under the rubble. The Israeli Defense Forces finally emerging with this 2-year-old child who had been trapped for days near the quake's epicenter. The boy, wrapped in blankets and put on a stretcher, was taken to the hospital Wednesday, where we're told he is now doing well. And we're so grateful to see that and pray that his family is okay too. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.